The new nanny heard muffled crying every night, always behind the same locked door. No one spoke about the twins, and the stepmother kept the house spotless, except for that one room. Curious and unsettled, she decided to investigate on her own, and what she found was terrifying. If you are interested in this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you are watching from. Let's continue. I promise you, this is going to be the best story you will ever hear in your life. The night settled over the mansion like a heavy blanket, muffling every sound except the faint, heartbreaking whimpers that echoed from behind a locked door on the second floor. Inside that room, 5-year-old twins Emma and Lily huddled together on a narrow bed, their small bodies trembling as they tried to muffle their sobs into the thin pillows. They had learned quickly that crying too loudly brought consequences far worse than the darkness that surrounded them each night. Margaret Chen moved silently through the marble hallway, her cleaning cart wheels barely making a sound against the polished floors. She had worked at the Whitmore mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut for 6 months now, and every night shift brought the same haunting soundtrack. The muffled crying of 2 little girls who should have been sleeping peacefully, dreaming innocent dreams, not weeping in fear and isolation. The housekeeper paused outside the locked door, her hand hovering near the handle. She knew better than to interfere. Mrs. Victoria Whitmore had made it abundantly clear that the children's room was off-limits to all staff. But tonight, something in Margaret's chest tightened unbearably. The sobs seemed more desperate, more broken than usual. She pressed her ear against the door and heard one of the twins whisper to the other in a voice raw from crying, "Mama would have held us. Mama would have sung to us." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She had seen the portrait of the late Mrs. Whitmore in the library, a beautiful woman with kind eyes who had passed away 2 years ago. These children barely remembered their mother's warmth, and their stepmother Victoria provided nothing but cold indifference. The sound of high heels clicking against marble made Margaret jump back from the door. Victoria Whitmore appeared at the end of the hallway, her designer dress immaculate, her expression as frozen as the ice sculptures she insisted on displaying in the foyer. She looked at Margaret with barely concealed contempt. "The floors won't clean themselves, Miss Chen," Victoria said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I suggest you focus on your duties and stop lingering where you don't belong." Margaret nodded quickly, pushing her cart forward, but as she passed Victoria, she caught the faintest hint of satisfaction in the woman's cold blue eyes. It made her stomach turn. Over the following weeks, Margaret began to notice patterns that disturbed her deeply. The twins were rarely seen in the common areas of the house, while Victoria hosted elaborate dinner parties and charity. Guileless, Emma and Lily remained invisible, locked away like shameful secrets. Margaret would find their meal trays returned to the kitchen, almost untouched, the small portions of plain rice and vegetables barely picked at, while the garbage bins overflowed with remnants of gourmet meals prepared for the adults. One afternoon, while cleaning the twins' room during one of their rare absences, Margaret noticed how sterile the space felt. It looked more like a hotel room than a place where children lived. The toys remained in sealed boxes, the books stacked neatly on shelves with spines uncracked. Only one item showed signs of use: a worn children's book with a handwritten dedication on the inside cover. "To my precious Emma and Lily, may you always know how deeply you are loved. Mama." The pages were wrinkled from small fingers, turning them over and over, and Margaret could see dried tear stains marking certain passages. Her heart broke imagining these little girls clinging to this one connection to their mother, while everything else in their lives grew colder and emptier. In the trash bin, Margaret discovered crumpled papers that made her blood run cold. School reports from Riverside Academy, dated over the past 6 months, each one more urgent than the last. Teachers noted dramatic changes in the twins' behavior. Once bright and engaged students, Emma and Lily had become withdrawn and silent. They no longer participated in class, rarely spoke to other children, and flinched at sudden movements or raised voices. Multiple requests for parent-teacher conferences had been sent, all marked "no response" in red ink. Margaret felt a weight settling on her shoulders. She recognized the signs of children suffering, but what could she do? She was just a housekeeper, an immigrant woman with limited English and no legal standing to interfere in a wealthy family's private matters. Victoria Whitmore had money, influence and connections throughout Greenwich's elite social circles. Who would believe Margaret's concerns over Victoria's polished public image? That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept hearing those muffled sobs, seeing those untouched meal trays, remembering the fear in the twins' eyes during the brief moment she glimpsed them. She thought of her own daughter back in Taiwan, safe and loved, and felt ashamed of her silence. The next morning during her break, Margaret walked to the Greenwich Public Library. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, just a sense that she needed guidance, information, something to help her understand what she could possibly do. She wandered through the aisles until she found herself in the social services section. An elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes was reshelving books nearby. She noticed Margaret's distress and approached gently. "Can I help you find something, dear?" Margaret hesitated, then the words tumbled out in halting English. "I work in-house. 2 little girls. They cry every night, locked in room, not enough food, nobody listened to them, I don't know what to do." The woman's expression shifted, from concern to recognition. She guided Margaret to a quiet corner and sat down with her. "My name is Dorothy Patterson. I was a social worker for 35 years before I retired. Tell me everything." For the next hour, Margaret poured out everything she had observed. Dorothy listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When Margaret finished, Dorothy's face was grave. "What you're describing sounds like severe neglect and emotional abuse," Dorothy said quietly. "But you're right to be concerned about coming forward. Families with money and influence often know how to protect themselves. You'll need more than observations. You'll need documentation, evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away." Dorothy pulled out a notepad and began writing. "Here's what you need to do. Document everything. Dates, times, specific incidents. If you can safely do so, record the children crying. Record any threatening or cruel statements made by the stepmother. Take photos of the untouched meals, the locked door, anything that shows the conditions these children are living in. Gather those school reports if you can access them. Build a case so strong that it cannot be ignored." Margaret felt fear and determination warring inside her. "What if I lose my job? What if they send me back to Taiwan?" Dorothy reached across and squeezed her hand. "What if you're the only chance those little girls have? I've seen too many cases where people looked away because it was easier, safer. I've lived with the regret of arriving too late to help children who needed someone to be brave for them. You have a choice to make, Margaret. It won't be easy, but it might save 2 lives." Margaret left the library with Dorothy's phone number tucked in her pocket and a small digital recorder Dorothy had given her from her old work supplies. That night, with trembling hands, Margaret pressed record as the twins' crying began. She captured Victoria's cold voice through the door, telling the girls they were ungrateful, that they should be thankful for having a roof over their heads, that if they didn't stop being so difficult, she would send them away where nobody would ever want them. The recordings were devastating. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret documented everything. She photographed the meal trays, the sterile room, the locked door. She made copies of the school reports she found in Victoria's home office. Each piece of evidence felt like a stone in her pocket, weighing her down with the responsibility of what she was about to do. She wasn't alone for long. Robert Hayes, the building's night security guard, approached her one evening as she was leaving. He was a quiet man in his 50s, who had worked security for various wealthy families for decades. "I know what you're doing," he said quietly, "and I want to help." Margaret's heart raced with fear. "I don't know what you mean." "I've watched those little girls for 2 years," Robert continued. "I've seen how they've changed since. Their mother passed and Victoria took over. I've heard the crying. I've seen them being led to the car for school looking terrified and exhausted. I've stayed silent because I needed this job, because I told myself it wasn't my business. But I can't do it anymore. Whatever you're planning, I can help. I have access to security logs. I can tell you when Victoria's away. I can be a witness." Margaret felt tears of relief and gratitude. She wasn't alone anymore. Within days, their quiet network grew. Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, who lived in the penthouse apartment above the Whitmore residence, finally admitted what she had been hearing through her floors for months. The crying that kept her awake at night, the sounds of children in distress that she had tried to ignore because she didn't want to get involved in her neighbor's private affairs. Her guilt drove her to offer her testimony. The pieces were coming together, but they needed more. They needed medical evidence. Dorothy connected Margaret with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a pediatrician who had spent 20 years working with vulnerable children. Dr. Mitchell had seen too many cases buried by wealth and influence, and she was determined this wouldn't be another one. The challenge was getting the twins to Dr. Mitchell without Victoria's knowledge. Robert monitored Victoria's schedule carefully and discovered she had a 3-day trip planned to New York for a charity gala. The moment Victoria's car pulled away from the mansion, Margaret acted. She used the master key she had access to as head housekeeper and opened the twins' room. Emma and Lily looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes, huddled together on their bed. They had learned to expect nothing good from adults. "I'm not going to hurt you," Margaret said, softly, kneeling down to their level. "I'm going to help you, but you need to trust me. Can you do that?" The twins looked at each other, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Emma, the slightly older twin by 3 minutes, nodded slowly. Margaret wrapped them in warm coats, noticing how thin they felt, how their clothes hung loose on their small frames. She led them quietly out of the mansion, where Robert waited with his car. They drove to Dr. Mitchell's private clinic, where the pediatrician was waiting. The examination was thorough and heartbreaking. Dr. Mitchell documented signs of malnutrition, anxiety, and psychological trauma. The twins were underweight, showed signs of chronic stress, and exhibited behavioral responses consistent with emotional abuse and neglect. They flinched at sudden movements, struggled to make eye contact, and when asked about their home life, they fell into terrified silence. Dr. Mitchell photographed everything, wrote detailed reports, and looked at Margaret with respect and sorrow. "You did the right thing bringing them here. This documentation, combined with everything else you've gathered, should be enough. But you need to move quickly. Once Victoria discovers what you've done, she'll use every resource she has to shut this down." Margaret returned the twins to the mansion before Victoria's return, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what she now had to do. The medical reports sat in a sealed envelope in her apartment, alongside the recordings, photographs, and school documents. She had built a case, but now she needed to know how to use it. Dorothy arranged a meeting with James Crawford, an attorney who specialized in child welfare cases. He had a reputation for taking on powerful families and winning. When Margaret spread all her evidence across his desk, Crawford's expression grew increasingly serious. "This is extensive documentation," he said, reviewing each piece carefully. "The medical reports alone are damning. But I need to be honest with you, Miss Chen. The Whitmore family has significant resources. Victoria's connections run deep in Greenwich society. They'll fight this with everything they have." "What do we need to make this stronger?" Margaret asked, her voice steady despite her fear. Crawford leaned back in his chair. "We need irrefutable visual evidence. Something that shows the pattern of abuse in real time that can't be explained away or dismissed as misunderstanding. Audio recordings can be questioned, photographs can be contextualized, but video evidence of ongoing neglect and psychological abuse would be nearly impossible to refute." Robert Hayes provided the solution. As head of security, he had access to install additional cameras. Working carefully over several nights, he placed tiny hidden cameras in strategic locations: the hallway outside the twins' room, the kitchen where meal trays were prepared and returned, and the main living areas where the stark contrast between the twins' treatment and Victoria's lifestyle could be documented. The footage they captured over the next 2 weeks was devastating. Victoria berating the twins in harsh whispers, telling them they were burdens, mistakes, reminders of a woman she had replaced. The twins being given minimal food, while elaborate meals were prepared for Victoria and her guests, the children being locked in their room for hours, sometimes entire days, while Victoria entertained friends mere feet away, laughing and socializing, as if the suffering children didn't exist. One particular recording captured Victoria's cruelty in stark detail. Emma had accidentally spilled water on the hallway carpet. Victoria's response was swift and psychologically brutal. She grabbed both twins by their arms, her perfectly manicured nails digging into their thin flesh, and hissed at them about how worthless they were, how their mother would be ashamed of them, how she should send them to an institution where nobody would have to deal with their constant neediness. The twins didn't cry. They had learned that tears only made things worse. They simply stood there, small and silent and utterly defeated, while the woman who was supposed to care for them destroyed what little remained of their sense of worth. Margaret watched the footage with tears streaming down her face. Dorothy sat beside her, one hand on her shoulder. "This is enough," Dorothy said quietly. "This is more than enough. It's time to act." Crawford agreed. He immediately filed an emergency petition with Connecticut's Department of Children and Families, including all the evidence they had gathered. The response was swift. Within 48 hours, a team of social workers and a family court judge reviewed the materials. An emergency removal order was issued, but before it could be executed, Margaret received a threatening phone call. The voice on the other end was male, cultured, and coldly furious. "Miss Chen, my name is Richard Whitmore. I'm Victoria's brother and legal counsel. I'm aware of your little campaign against my sister. I strongly suggest you cease this harassment immediately. My family has significant influence in this community. We can make your life very difficult. Immigration status can be reviewed, employment can be terminated, legal action for defamation can be pursued. Think very carefully about your next steps." Margaret's hands shook as she held the phone, but her voice remained steady. "I have evidence of child abuse and neglect. I have a legal and moral obligation to report it. Your threats won't change that." "Evidence can be disputed," Richard replied smoothly. "Immigrant housekeepers with limited English can be discredited. Are you really prepared to go up against the Whitmore family? We've been part of Greenwich society for 3 generations. Who do you think people will believe?" Margaret ended the call and immediately contacted Crawford, who recorded her account of the conversation. "This is witness intimidation," Crawford said grimly. "It actually strengthens our case. They're showing exactly the kind of behavior that allows abuse to continue unchecked. They believe their money and status put them above accountability." The next morning, social workers arrived at the Whitmore mansion with police escort and a court order. Victoria's composure finally cracked when she realized what was happening. She tried to block access to the twins' room, insisting this was all a misunderstanding, that she loved the children, that Margaret was a disgruntled employee spreading lies, but the evidence spoke louder than her protests. The twins were removed from the home immediately and taken to a safe house for emergency foster care. Medical professionals conducted thorough examinations. Child psychologists began gentle interviews. Every finding confirmed what Margaret had documented. Victoria was prohibited from any contact with the children. The twins' father, David Whitmore, who had been largely absent during his new wife's reign of cruelty, was served with legal papers. His parental rights were temporarily suspended, pending investigation into his failure to protect his daughters. The case moved to family court with unusual speed, driven by the overwhelming evidence and the severity of the neglect. Richard Whitmore hired an expensive legal team that tried every tactic to discredit the evidence. They claimed the recordings were taken illegally, that Margaret had manipulated situations to make Victoria look bad, that the medical findings were exaggerated. But Crawford was prepared for every argument. The recordings were legal under Connecticut's one-party consent law, as Robert had been present and consenting during many of the incidents. The video footage showed clear patterns over weeks, not isolated incidents. The medical evidence was supported by multiple independent professionals. The school reports provided a timeline of the twins' deterioration that predated Margaret's employment. Most damaging to Victoria's defense was the testimony of the twins themselves. In a private session with the judge and child psychologists, Emma and Lily, speaking in quiet, hesitant voices, described their daily reality. The hunger, the isolation, the fear, the constant messages that they were unwanted and unloved. Their words, delivered without drama or exaggeration, were heartbreaking in their simple honesty. The judge's ruling was comprehensive and unequivocal. Victoria Whitmore was permanently barred from any contact with the children and faced civil penalties for child endangerment. David Whitmore's custody was revoked, though he was granted supervised visitation rights contingent on completing parenting classes and therapy. Permanent custody was awarded to the twins' maternal aunt, Jennifer Morrison, who had been fighting for access to her nieces for 2 years, but had been systematically blocked by Victoria. Jennifer was everything Victoria was not: warm, loving, genuinely devoted to the children's well-being. When she arrived to take Emma and Lily to their new home, the twins clung to her with a desperation that spoke volumes about how starved they had been for affection. The case attracted significant media attention. Initial attempts by the Whitmore family to control the narrative failed when Crawford released carefully selected evidence to the press. The story of 2 vulnerable children rescued by a brave housekeeper who risked everything to protect them resonated deeply. Public opinion turned decisively against Victoria and the systems that had allowed such abuse to continue in plain sight. Margaret became an unexpected public figure, though she tried to avoid the spotlight. Reporters wanted to interview her, calling her a hero. She deflected the praise, insisting she had simply done what anyone with a conscience should do. But privately, the experience had transformed her. Dorothy encouraged her to channel her experience into something lasting. "You have a voice now, Margaret. People are listening. Use it to help other children who might be suffering in silence." With Dorothy's mentorship and support from several child welfare organizations, Margaret enrolled in community college to study social work. Her unique perspective as someone who had witnessed abuse from the inside of a wealthy household, combined with her personal courage in coming forward, made her a powerful advocate. She began speaking at conferences about the signs of child abuse in affluent families, challenging the assumption that wealth equates to proper care. She trained household staff, security personnel, and service workers on recognizing and reporting suspected abuse, emphasizing that they often have access to private family dynamics that others never see. 3 years after the twins' rescue, Margaret founded the Emma and Lily Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to training domestic workers and service professionals in child abuse recognition and reporting. The foundation also provided legal support and protection for workers who came forward with concerns, addressing the fear of retaliation that kept so many silent. The twins themselves flourished in Jennifer's care. The transformation was remarkable. Within months they began to smile again, to play, to act like the children they should have been all along. They returned to school and slowly rebuilt their confidence and social skills. Therapy helped them process their trauma, though the scars would take years to fully heal. As they grew older, Emma and Lily learned the full story of their rescue. They sought out Margaret, now a licensed social worker, to thank her. The meeting was emotional for everyone involved. The twins, now teenagers, articulate and strong, told Margaret that she had given them back their lives. "We remember being so scared all the time," Emma said, her voice steady but her eyes bright with tears. "We thought that was just how life was supposed to be. You showed us that someone cared enough to fight for us. That changed everything." Lily added, "We want to do what you do. Help other kids who feel as alone and scared as we did. You didn't just save us, you showed us how to save others." Both twins went on to study psychology, specializing in childhood trauma. They became therapists working with children from abusive situations, bringing unique empathy and understanding to their work. The cycle of pain had been broken and transformed into a legacy of healing. Margaret continued her work for decades, training thousands of workers, helping to rescue dozens of children from abusive situations, and advocating for stronger protections and reporting systems. She never forgot those first nights hearing the twins cry, the fear she felt taking those first recordings, the moment she decided that silence was no longer an option. Dorothy remained a close friend and mentor until her final days, proud of the movement she had helped spark with one conversation in a library. Robert Hayes became the Foundation's head of security training, teaching others how to use their positions to protect the vulnerable. Dr. Mitchell served on the Foundation's medical advisory board, ensuring that healthcare professionals knew how to recognize and document signs of abuse. Eleanor Ashford, the neighbor whose testimony had been crucial, became a major donor to the foundation, driven by her regret at not acting sooner. She often said that supporting the foundation's work was her way of making amends for the months she had heard suffering and done nothing. Years later, at a foundation gala celebrating 20 years of operation, Margaret stood before a room full of supporters, advocates, and survivors. Emma and Lily sat in the front row, now accomplished professionals in their own right, their own children playing quietly nearby. Those children would grow up knowing they were loved, safe, and valued, a stark contrast to their mother's early years. Margaret spoke about the importance of courage, of refusing to look away from suffering even when it's easier or safer to remain silent. She talked about how change begins with one person deciding that a child's well-being matters more than their own comfort or security. "I was terrified," Margaret admitted to the crowd. "I was just a housekeeper. I had no power, no status, no legal expertise. But I had eyes to see suffering and a heart that couldn't ignore it. That turned out to be enough, not because I was special, but because I chose to act. Each of you has that same power. The question is whether you'll use it." The foundation's impact rippled outward. Laws were strengthened to protect workers who reported abuse. Training programs were implemented across the service industry. Public awareness campaigns challenged the assumption that wealth and status precluded abuse. Hundreds of children were identified and helped because someone in their household had been trained to recognize the signs and empowered to report them. Margaret never returned to housekeeping, but she never forgot where she came from or the vulnerability she had felt as an immigrant worker facing powerful people. That perspective informed everything she did, ensuring that the foundation always centered the voices and experiences of those who were often overlooked and underestimated. On quiet evenings, Margaret would sometimes think back to those nights in the Whitmore mansion, hearing those muffled sobs, feeling that crushing weight of knowing something was terribly wrong, but not knowing if she could do anything about it. She thought about how close she had come to staying silent, to telling herself it wasn't her place to interfere. And then she would look at the photos on her wall. Emma and Lily at their high school graduation, beaming with pride. At their college commencement, at their weddings, holding their own children, living full, healthy, joyful lives that had almost been destroyed before. They truly began. Those photos reminded her that courage didn't require being fearless. It just required caring enough to act despite the fear. And that one person, even someone who felt powerless, could change the trajectory of lives, could break cycles of abuse, could create ripples of healing that extended far beyond what they could imagine. The foundation continued its work long after Margaret's retirement, a living legacy of what happens when someone refuses to look away from suffering. Training programs expanded internationally. Thousands of workers were empowered to be the eyes and ears protecting vulnerable children. Legal protections strengthened. Reporting systems improved. And countless children were saved because someone in their life had learned to recognize the signs and had the courage to act. Emma and Lily eventually took leadership roles in the foundation, bringing their professional expertise and personal experience to guide its evolution. They expanded services to include direct support for trauma survivors, therapy programs, and educational initiatives teaching children about their rights and how to seek help. The story of two little girls crying in a locked room and the housekeeper who heard them and refused to stay silent became a touchstone in child welfare advocacy. It was taught in social work programs, discussed in policy debates, and shared in training sessions around the world, not as a fairy tale with easy answers, but as a real example of how systemic change begins with individual moral courage.